All right, let's jump in. We've covered World War One and in between the wars in this period, but now it's time to kind of wrap up this unit and start discussing World War Two. So let's talk about the outbreak of World War Two. It's often been said that Europe stumbled into World War One in 1914. Historians of World War One often suggest the blame for the outbreak of war ought to be shared among a variety of countries, and most of these historians do not accept the idea that one single country was entirely to blame. Now, fast forward 25 years. World War II is totally different. Europe did not accidentally stumble into this war. Instead, it was brought about by the will of one man, Adolf Hitler. Hitler was to blame for World War II. He was fueled by fanatical anti Semitism and a desire to see the German Reich expand. Hitler started World War II when he first sent troops to invade Poland in September 1939, despite being warned not to. So let's take a look at some of the events and circumstances that preceded the outbreak of the war. At times, things occur in history that we would all just rather forget, especially when they occur in recent history. It's far easier to understand a genocide occurring thousands of years ago, far harder when we have grandparents which remember it. Regardless of how nasty the subject might be, it is important for us to learn about the event so that we might prevent it from ever happening again. And such is certainly the case with the rise and fall of the mastermind of 20th century's greatest genocide, Adolf Hitler. He was born the third son of a third marriage to an aging Austrian customs official in 1889. He did not enjoy a happy childhood. Adolf and his brothers were treated harshly by their father, a strict disciplinarian who likely beat his children and most certainly beat Adolf's mother. In 1900, Hitler escaped his boyhood home, being sent to Linz to study to become a civil servant. Now, despite this choice by his father, Hitler resisted. He was hoping to become an artist. A few years after his father's death, Hitler took all of his savings and inheritance and moved to Vienna in order to apply for art school. His failure, coupled with his mother's death from cancer, threw Hitler's life in disarray. Out of his strong sense of German patriotism, Hitler considered himself more German than Austrian. He enlisted in the German military in World War I. After Germany's defeat in World War I, Hitler's hatred for those responsible for the German defeat, a burden he increasingly placed on Jews and foreigners, manifested itself in a keen interest in German politics. In 1919, he joined the German Workers' Party after attending a meeting, and he became an increasingly central figure within the small party's leadership. By 1920, the party was holding mass meetings, and under Hitler's guidance, the party rebranded itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi for short. In 1920, with a heavily nationalist, xenophobic, and anti-Semitic platform. Xenophobic means fear of foreigners. So the party rapidly gained membership, partly as a result of Hitler's natural gift for rousing oratory. If you ever hear him speak, I would suggest going out on YouTube and looking up some of his speeches. He is very, motivational and very convincing. So as the Nazi Party rose in notoriety, the German economy floundered due to the terms imposed by the Allied powers after World War I. Now, with Germany in disarray, Hitler saw his opportunity to seize power and in 1923 organized a plot to overthrow the Weimar Republic. The Beer Hall Putsch, as it has come to be known, failed miserably, and Hitler was tried for treason the following year and imprisoned. During his time in prison, he wrote the part autobiography, part philosophical treatise, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, which served as a partial manifesto for the Nazi Party after his release. Hitler resumed his political involvement and assumed leadership of the Nazi Party after his release from prison in December 1924, having served only 9 months in prison. And though Hitler was banned by the Bavarian government from public speaking for 2 years, he spent this time reorganizing his party. Hitler's new Nazi Party was not aimed at overthrowing the German government, but instead at gaining power by working within democratic rules. Now, at the same time, Hitler organized his party officers and foot soldiers, the notorious SA and SS, into something akin to a paramilitary force under his direction. You may have heard people speak of the brown shirts. Hitler's party grew membership slowly during the 1920s, and his party's opportunity to gain real political clout came with another economic downturn in the German economy, this one caused by the Great Depression in 1929. Seizing their opportunity, the Nazi Party staged a massive campaign in the lead up to the 1930 elections and the German people responded with considerable support, making the Nazi Party the second largest party in the German Reichstag. And through political maneuvers, Hitler got himself appointed Chancellor of the Reichstag by President Hindenburg only 3 days later. And yes, this is the same General Hindenburg from World War I. Utilizing his SA and SS and the political clout the Nazi Party had gained in the Reichstag during the 1932 elections, Hitler and the Nazis began stripping the German government of its democracy, centralizing authority in the chancellorship. By April 1933, Hitler was the virtual dictator of Germany. So let's look at 1930s Germany and what Hitler's party and himself were encountering and dealing with. The 1930s saw Germany become increasingly enveloped by Hitler's cult of personality and the incredibly nationalist, xenophobic, and anti-Semitic values of the Nazi Party. Hitler centralized power through reorganizing the SA and SS and forming the Gestapo, murdering, exiling, or imprisoning many former devotees in the process. Jews came under increased pressure as the Nazi Party sponsored boycotts of Jewish businesses, and events like the Night of Broken Glass, Glasnost, in 1938 fostered increased violence against Jewish institutions and Jews themselves. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws were instituted, which placed hundreds of restrictions on Jews and Jewish life in Germany. At the same time, Hitler's Germany began flouting international laws in the name of uniting all ethnic Germans under the German flag. In 1936, the German army marched into the Rhineland, where they were forbidden to be by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and in 1938 and 1939 annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, respectively. Internally, the Nazi Party whipped the German people into a nationalistic fervor. All things German were prized, and the German people were encouraged to raise large families and live healthy lifestyles in order to be of service to the German state. The 1936 German Olympics were seen as an opportunity to showcase Germany and the superiority of the German people. Didn't quite go as planned. If you've ever heard of Jesse Owens, a black athlete from the United States who, went and kind of flouted that racial superiority ideas of Hitler by winning the gold medal. Now, German militarism and expansion in the 1930s caused international tensions to rise. And Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom's policy of appeasement, essentially conceding territory and rights to Germany to avoid war, only emboldened Hitler in Germany. In other words, he takes Czechoslovakia, Neville Chamberlain flies out to speak with Hitler, and Hitler's like, listen, we just want to protect German-speaking people there, and that's all our only interest. We're not going to expand any further. And Neville's like, okay, yeah, I can understand that. We're good. Nice to meet you, Hitler. We'll see you later. Goes back to United Kingdom and praises him pretty much. But in 1939, Germany began World War II when it invaded Poland, causing Great Britain and France to come to Poland's aid. Poland had no German speakers, but Hitler's idea was to expand in a philosophy called space race. He needed space for the German peoples to expand and grow so that they could take over as the master race, a superior place in the world, and Poles were pretty inferior, so why not just take their land, move them out? Hitler's German forces quickly advanced through the Low Countries, that's Belgium and France, taking Paris in June 1940. So while Germany spread its influence over Europe, within Germany and in the lands it conquered, Hitler began his systematic elimination of the Jewish race, the disabled, and any foreign nationality Hitler came across which he despised, in particular Russians and Poles. This plan he termed his final solution, and he carried it out by shipping these people to camps where they were often worked to death and then murdered. As the war dragged on, these camps increasingly became extermination camps where prisoners, especially Jewish ones, were executed soon after arrival. All told, by the end of the war, approximately 11 million were murdered in Hitler's death camps, with as many as 6 million being Jews, though estimates vary widely. Several military blunders during World War II would prove the beginning of the end for Hitler and Nazi Germany. The invasion of Russia in the summer of 1941 would prove a costly mistake, very similar to Napoleon's invasion of Russia. As Germany expanded vast amounts of resources for every inch of Russian soil it gained, eventually they were turned back at the Battle of Stalingrad. In 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily and began conquering Italy, leading to the overthrow of Hitler's closest ally, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. So with the summer 1944 D-Day invasion of France, Hitler's German forces were now fighting the Allies on 4 fronts: the East, the West, Italy, and in North Africa. And this overextended German resources to the breaking point, and despite hard fighting on all fronts, German forces were forced to slowly retreat. So with the Allies closing in on Berlin in April 1945, Hitler and his longtime girlfriend, Eva Braun, committed suicide inside Hitler's bunker. And within a week, in early May, Germany surrendered to the Allies, and Hitler's Germany had ended. Now, after Hitler came to power in the early 1930s, he embarked upon a plan to restore German national honor according to National Socialist aims. And this involved defying the Treaty of Versailles by remilitarization and expanding German territorial claims. So the Treaty of Versailles forbid Germany from having a military. So Hitler kind of got around that by calling them police orders and would disguise them as no, they're training to be policemen in times of this economic chaos with mobs and everything. In early 1936, the Rhineland was remilitarized in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. It was an area that was under the protection of France that Germans weren't allowed to govern. And the Locarno treaties of 1925 further clarified that. For the most part, though, when Hitler does these things, what do Germany's neighbors like France, Great Britain do? They stand by, doing little to punish Hitler's Germany. A few months later, when the Spanish Civil War broke out, Nazi Germany supported fascist nationalist forces under the leadership of Francisco Franco. And this was important because it allowed German weaponry to be tested in battle. Now, throughout the 1930s, Germany secretly began rearming itself. For example, the Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany from having an air force. To get around this, Germany trained pilots in secret and under the mantle of the German Air Sport Association. And this organization was headed by Hermann Goering, who in a few years would be in charge of Germany's Luftwaffe, or Air Force. Similarly, Germany also began rebuilding its U-boat fleet in secret. Toward the end of 1936, Germany and Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, which was basically an anti-communist alliance in which the powers would consult with one another to safeguard common interests. Italy joined the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1937, and this set the foundation for the Rome-Berlin Axis. And the Rome-Berlin Axis, or the alliance between Italy and Germany, was cemented under the Pact of Steel in May of 1939. Benito Mussolini was kind of a hero to Hitler, but Hitler soon eclipsed Benito Mussolini. So in September 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan agreed to the Tripartite Pact of 1940, which formally established the Axis powers. Now, throughout the mid to late 1930s, Italy and Japan began invading their respective neighboring states. For example, Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, and Japan invaded China in 1937, and the Soviet Union in 1938. And these events and others like them were red flags warning of an impending global war. The real tension, however, centered around Germany's plans for territorial expansion. In March 1938, Germany annexed the Republic of Austria in what has been called the Anschluss. And this German word means union, and usually refers to Austria being absorbed into Nazi Germany so that all German-speaking peoples, and you'll notice that from the unification of Germany that this is kind of a goal of Germany, now it also includes Austria. This annexation did not come about overnight. For years, Nazi Germany had supported the Austrian National Socialist Party in an attempt to win over the country. Austria had a high percentage of ethnic Germans, and many people living in Austria saw themselves as basically German. Thus, when German troops crossed the border into Austria on the morning of March 12, 1938, they were greeted as heroes. Wehrmacht soldiers were greeted with flowers and celebration, and in the days to come, Hitler toured Austria, where he too was greeted enthusiastically. And European powers did little to protest the Anschluss. Realizing European neighbors were unwilling to confront him, Hitler proceeded to claim other regions in an attempt to expand the German Reich. Soon after the Anschluss of Austria, Hitler instigated the Sudeten Crisis. And the Sudeten Crisis of 1938 stemmed from Hitler's desire to see the Sudetenland area of Czechoslovakia annexed to Germany. Hitler essentially employed the same scheme he did against Austria. He reasoned that because the Sudetenland contained high percentages of ethnic Germans, the region should belong to Germany. And the dispute between the Western European powers and Germany over the Sudetenland was finally resolved in the Munich Agreement. This settlement between France, Great Britain, Italy, and Germany permitted Germany to annex the Sudetenland. This is what I talked about when I said Neville Chamberlain went to talk to Hitler about this, in exchange for Hitler's guarantee that Germany would make no more territorial demands for Europe. Sadly, representatives from Czechoslovakia were not even invited to the settlement meeting. The Western European democracies basically turned their back on Czechoslovakia. Think the 17th century partition of Poland. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain played a prominent role in negotiating the deal. After an agreement had been worked out, he famously claimed to have secured peace for our time as he excitedly waved the paper agreement in the air. And you can find video of this on YouTube if you want to look up his speech. So because of this, Chamberlain's reputation remains pretty controversial. He's seen as an appeaser, someone who tries to, when someone is doing something bad to you, you try to appease them or give them stuff so that they'll lay off you instead of standing up for yourself. So he's widely seen as embodying Europe's policy of appeasement. And what is appeasement? In the context of World War II, appeasement refers to Europe's policy of appeasing Hitler. It refers to Europe's refusal to stand up to Hitler, instead giving in to his demands. So Hitler stood by his word not to occupy any other European countries, and it all turned out just fine, right? Wrong. In March 1939, German forces invaded the remainder of Czechoslovakia. On top of that, Germany began making demands that the free city of Danzig be handed over to Germany. By this point, Germany's neighbors were finally realizing Hitler could not be trusted. France and Great Britain publicly pledged to support Poland should it be invaded by Germany. Realizing war was likely to break out, Germany sought to establish a peace treaty with the Soviet Union on its eastern front to avoid what would eventually happen, having to fight wars on many different fronts. In August 1939, the Nazi-Soviet Union Non-Aggression Pact was signed. Sometimes this pact is also called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact after the two diplomats who negotiated it. And this agreement meant Germany did not have to worry about the Soviet Union intervening should war break out. 2 weeks later, German troops invaded Poland on the pretext that Poland had first attacked Germany, which is hilarious to think of because the Polish army was still on horseback. Matter of fact, when German tanks come rolling in, credit to their bravery. But Polish troops came out with lances like knights and were charging the tanks. So yeah, it's hard to believe that Poland would have invaded Germany and instigated war. France and Great Britain, though, followed through on their pledge to support Poland. And with Germany's invasion of Poland, World War II had begun. A lot of American students have the mistaken impression that World War II was caused by the Holocaust. That's the Nazi persecution of European Jews. But that's definitely not the right answer. Before we can even begin to discuss the causes of World War II, we need to go back to World War I. People across the world had said that the Great War, as it was called at the time, was the war to end all wars. At its conclusion, the punishing Treaty of Versailles was supposed to have rendered Germany completely impotent. The League of Nations was formed to prevent future wars of aggression. There were numerous treaties and agreements signed between different nations in the 1920s. What's more, the Senate's Nye Committee, the United States Senate, had convinced the United States government that World War I had been more about money than national security, leading to policies that established America's neutrality in conflicts around the world. So how did another world war, more destructive than the first, originate with Germany and go unchecked by the League of Nations? Why in the world did Japan get involved? They're clear across the world. And how did America get sucked in again when it was so anti-involved in European affairs? President Wilson had said that the United States' involvement in World War I would make the world safe for democracy. Yet within 2 decades, many parts of Europe and Asia had turned away from democracy and embraced one man or one party rule, and several of these leaders were not content to stay within their borders. Benito Mussolini formed the Fascist Party in 1919, and by 1926 he had complete control over Italy. Then he moved to reestablish the old Roman Empire by invading Ethiopia, a country he found to be very weak and easy to take over, in October of 1935. Yet the League of Nations looked on. Without a military force, they couldn't do much more than embargo certain exports to Italy. Adolf Hitler was inspired by this. After consolidating fascist power in 1933, Germany's chancellor tested the limits of the League's power. But nothing had happened when he withdrew his nation from the League that year, or when he announced Germany's rearmament and compulsory military service in 1935. So when the League of Nations failed to stop Mussolini's expansion, Hitler turned his attention outward. In 1936, he sent 32,000 troops with air support into an area known as the Rhineland, which was a demilitarized buffer zone between Germany and France created by the Treaty of Versailles. What did the League of Nations do? They officially disapproved. They sent a very strongly worded letter to Adolf Hitler. And then Germany and Italy signed a military alliance in 1936, also in violation of Versailles. The League of Nations, silence. Germany and Italy both sent aid to the fascist leader of Spain during that nation's civil war, though the League had forbidden foreign involvement. In 1938, Hitler's Anschluss and the reunification of Germany and Austria went unopposed. Then in September of 1938, Great Britain and France, eager to avoid another costly war, signed the Munich Agreement approving Germany's occupation of the Sudetenland, which was a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia, because Hitler promised he wouldn't try to take any more territory. And then for a few months, Europe thought that might be the worst of it. But Europe wasn't the only part of the world dealing with aggressive, ultra-nationalistic leaders. By 1931, China had been embroiled in civil war for 4 years, and Japan took advantage of this instability. But Europe wasn't, in 1931, they fabricated an excuse to invade Manchuria and seize control of its resources. The international community did little to intervene until Japan invaded Shanghai the following year, where a large population of expatriates or Europeans lived. When the League of Nations protested, Japan withdrew from the organization and sporadic fighting continued. By 1937, China and Japan were in an all-out war, beginning with the reinvasion of Shanghai. Quickly, Japanese forces moved in on the capital of Nanking in 1937, and America evacuated its citizens. The U.S. gunboat Panay and 3 corporate-owned oil tankers were leaving Nanking with the last of the civilians when they were attacked by the Japanese Navy. Now, obviously, the United States was a neutral country, didn't want to go to war, and the Japanese had just committed an act of war against them by attacking them. But to avoid a diplomatic crisis with the United States, Emperor Hirohito claimed that the sinking of the Panay was an accident and apologized. But Americans were further horrified by unspeakable Japanese atrocities carried out upon the Chinese capital in the coming weeks, an event known as the Rape of Nanking. And it's debated how many people died in the Rape of Nanking. I've already spoken about that, but it could have been in the several hundreds of thousands, and the Chinese still celebrate that as a national day of remembrance. So the United States, as a result of these things, passed economic sanctions against Japan and sent aid to China. And one of my favorite pieces of aid, my father-in-law's huge buff of this period, is Curtis LeMay and the Flying Tigers. They were they were U.S. Air Force, or U.S. Army at the time, U.S. Army Air Force, but they worked as mercenaries for the Chinese with the armies kind of under the cover of permission. By 1939, Japan's war against China was floundering, and the nation, now under the influence of a military mastermind named Hideki Tojo, looked for a way to combat American intervention. Now, I've thrown a bunch of things at you, and I want to try to, for the end of today, bring them together to kind of see how they all fit. On September 1st, 1939, the fast-moving, well-trained German army stormed across the Polish border from the north, south, and west, while Soviet troops moved in on the helpless nation from the east a couple of weeks later. So the Soviets also attacked Poland. Finally, the European democracies had enough. The invasion of Poland prompted Britain and France to declare war on Germany. And within months, Hitler's army controlled most of Northern and Western Europe, and his air force was keeping Great Britain at bay. And at the moment, it didn't look like the European nations were in any position to defend those colonies. If Japan could get control of some of them, Tojo would have the resources he needed to continue his conquest and prevent other foreign governments from supplying aid to China through their colonies. I apologize here on my glasses because I think I might have skipped one here and I'm not sure. Nope, I was doing good. So Japan formally made an alliance with Germany and Italy in September 1940, forming the core of what we call the Axis powers. And soon thereafter, Japan occupied French Indochina. Indochina is the nation we now know today as Vietnam. Still, the US refused to declare war in either Europe or Asia. Instead, the government allowed certain types of arms sales to its European allies and instituted a complete oil embargo against Japan. In 1941, both Germany and Japan wanted to discourage American involvement in their conquest schemes and weaken America's ability to fight, just in case it did decide to declare war. So Hitler's submarines began targeting US ships approaching England, and Tojo, now prime minister, decided to attack several US positions in the Pacific, including the naval base at Pearl Harbor. The world was at war again, and America had been pulled in. On December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, that's my FDR impersonation, the Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack against Allied possessions in the Pacific, including the American military base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. After decades of conflict between the two nations, the US declared war. And we'll get into some of the military stuff tomorrow and some of what's going on during the war at that time. So any questions today?
So when Austria joined Germany, was Hungary not with them at that time anymore?
No, Hungary was a separate nation as a part of the Treaty of Versailles. It was forced to separate from Austria.
Okay, so they did not join Germany.
No.
Okay.
Good question. Any others?
No, I think everything else is like clear.
Okay. All right. Well, then hopefully I'll see you tomorrow. Have a good day.
You too.